Welcome to the Conservative Alliance podcast, the show that discusses everything from a libertarian conservative twist. I'm James, and today I'm joined by Jason. On today's show, we'll be talking about political theory, the NHS, China, and the Labour Party. I'm joined by Jason Emms from the LibertyBunker show. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm very well, James. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you coping under the lockdown conditions at the moment?
Yeah. Grinning and bearing it. But you can only do that, can't you? Really?
You can't do anything else. Grin and bear it.
Yeah.
So, if it's all right with you, I'd like to jump into our first topic. What do you think defines the left and right spectrum in politics?
It's a very difficult question, isn't it? Because I think everybody has their own different view on what the left and right is. I think traditionally in the UK, the left and right has been kind of defined by the working class versus the middle class. I think Thatcher changed that in the 80s with a big bang. So more of an aspirational kind of sentiment was encroaching into, say, the working class, which helped change. Obviously, Boris Johnson, with his modern take on one nation conservatism, has also helped with that. We've seen, like in the last general election, a huge change in what were traditionally working class voting areas or Labour strongholds have shifted to the Tories.
Yeah,
I think
Bolsover being an example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, certain areas we thought maybe would probably never be under a Conservative MP have shifted. So it's quite a change. I think, obviously, America has a very different view. Conservative, I think, actually means something more significant in America because under the idea of the American Constitution, they're protecting their Bill of Rights. So conservative is actually trying to conserve something. I think in the UK, we don't have such a black and white definition of what we are trying to conserve. So in America, I'd say it's probably conservative versus progressive. You obviously have progressive elements that probably want to eliminate things like the Second Amendment and maybe parts of the First Amendment with to do, with free speech. But I suppose, but then there's so much nuance to it. I mean, I've talked about this on my YouTube channel, how when I've talked to people who self-define themselves as, Marxists or, pure Marxists, I often agree with them on a lot of things. So I would probably define myself as a small c conservative, but I'm not necessarily a Tory voter. I didn't vote for the Tories in the last general election, but I have like a fairly anti-war stance. I think the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were a mistake. I think recreational drugs should be fully legalized. These are things that are kind of commonalities that I would have with someone that probably is a pure Marxist or, say, an anarchist, a communist of that. The anti-state communists I probably have quite a lot of, alliance
Libertarian.
with. Yeah, the libertarian, but libertarians are very much, I think, in the wider population. If you asked 100 people in the UK what a libertarian is, you probably wouldn't get much more than, say, 5 or 10 out of 100.
Yeah, it's definitely a nuanced position.
Yeah,
it's very niche.
Yeah, so it's definitely blurred lines. So I would consider myself a conservative, or at least a small c conservative. But certainly, there's a lot more nuance to that than just a simple black and white answer. I think just to point at left wing, right wing, and then we can move on. Is I think it used to be about, say, middle class versus working class, but certainly in the last 15 or say 20 years, it's become the left has been the woke element, and then there's kind of everybody else. So it's moved away from, say, capitalism versus socialism more into more of a culture war in terms of, are you woke or are you not woke? Are you an intersectionalist, or are you, what would, for lack of a better word, just a normal person? It's moved away from economics, I think, much more into a cultural kind of domain now.
Economic. I'd say economical as well, especially in the last election. Now we know. I'd ask: is it simple to simply say, is it socialism versus conservatism? And what I mean by that is, socialism, its economic model is defined right there in its name.
Yeah.
But conservatism, you would say, is generally capitalist. Well, you'd think. I have to take I believe anyway, that in the country, the Conservative Party tries and balances both interventionism in the markets.
Yeah.
So are they truly capitalist? We don't know. But in the last election, it was down to, can we believe the socialist economic model? Can we believe its principle? And no, it was astonishing on question time when you had people, like you've just said, voters of the Labour Party going, how can you afford this? How and it came down to economics as well, not just social policies.
I think the average voter probably would, if they don't have like a full sort of understanding of maybe why communism has tended to fail, or even like heavy socialism has tended to fail, it's probably quite appealing to vote for socialists, or at least socialist policies, because why it's a lot easier to say, well, let's just vote this person in that's going to make living standards better, rather than turning it on the voter and saying, well, what can you do to increase living standards? But I think I think that Jeremy Corbyn's policies were just a little bit too much, maybe too soon. I mean, I think some of the policies are probably quite dangerous, but yeah, I think that the UK population are intelligent enough to know that there's no magic money tree. Ultimately, we know taxes come from the taxpayers. We know that things have to be affordable if they're going to be sustainable in the long term. So ultimately, the democratic process has worked quite well in the UK in terms of, we did avoid Jeremy Corbyn, which my personal opinion think that probably wouldn't have been a good thing for the UK long term. So yeah, maybe there is something in democracy. People can see through the political veils and generally do the right thing.
Now, you touched on it before, very slightly, libertarianism. Oh, well, you didn't touch on it per se. I brought it up when you were talking about at least anarchists and
yeah.
But one thing that's striking me at the moment, I'm a member of the Libertarian Party in the UK, but I would say I'm a conservative libertarian. I believe in the laissez-faire markets idea, but I can also be quite socially conservative. So it's quite a contradiction. That's fair to say.
Yeah, I'd probably be in a similar ballpark to that. I would probably define myself as a libertarian, but the same in terms of like a minarchist, thinking there needs to be a government at some level, because
night watchman philosophy.
Yeah, definitely. And even when we talk about like the current virus sweeping the globe, we can see at certain elements you probably need some sort of governmental response rather than just necessarily a free market. We can criticize that maybe if the government's doing too much or too little. And not only that, I think with the modern world, with sort of multinational corporations, there's sort of somewhat of an insight. If you had no government, then do we all just sort of worship Google or Amazon? You can see the power that Google and Amazon have now, more so with Google because it's to do with free speech, but they can pretty much, or Silicon Valley as a whole, can pretty much shut down a voice if they want to. You've seen this with certain YouTubers, probably best not to say the names because it might trigger the algorithm, but there's certain YouTubers that have just been wiped off the face of the earth and just now only rely on maybe their own independent website. So Silicon Valley has a lot of power. So yeah,
well, I had an issue with Facebook yesterday. I
really?
barely scathed through it. It was a meme, okay?
Yeah.
And it had a very blurred picture of Hitler in the background. There was no swastika, so I'm very surprised it triggered the algorithm, okay?
Yeah.
And it said, to all you dobbing in your neighbours, you would do the Reich proud. Or no, actually, it said you'd do the right thing.
Yeah.
Within 2 minutes, it automatically got picked up, and I had to appeal it because they'd taken the page down. And it's like, it's a meme, people. Yeah. It's a meme. I do not believe in National Socialism. I don't believe in Nazism. Christ.
Yeah. And if anything, it's history. It's taking a play on history in a light-hearted way. It's you're not endorsing anybody. You're not sort of saying
no.
It's in fact it's the opposite. It's probably like, this is maybe a warning from history that we should not be paranoid about, but sort of say
always
sometimes
question.
Yeah, always question. It's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I was just wanting to bring in was with this conservatism versus libertarianism. I don't think there's a difference between them at all. But unfortunately, in the UK, the left, you could say, are all united. So the Green Party. You know what? I'll throw the Dems into that. They at least
Yeah.
are centre left. The Labour Party, which we will come on to later on briefly, has hopefully at least dropped its Marxist approach. They're all united. But then you've got libertarians within the Conservative Party fighting the big C Conservatives. You've got libertarians outside of the Conservative Party fighting the Conservatives. We're not unified when we should. And it was Ronald Reagan that says, if you analyse it, I believe the very heart and soul of conservatism is libertarianism. I think conservatism is really a misnomer, just as liberalism is a misnomer for liberals. If we were back in the days of the revolution, so-called conservatives today would be the liberals, and the liberals would be the Tories. The basis of conservatism is the desire for less government interference or less centralised authority or more individual freedom. And this is a pretty general description also of what libertarianism is. So why I create a conservative alliance is because I recognise this as well. Libertarians and conservatives don't need to fight each other. We need to fight the external forces that are trying to remove that, your individual freedom, the one that's wanting to have more centralized government, the one who's wanting to take all power you have over your little state, your own life, away from you.
Yeah,
I don't know what you think of that.
I think that's a really important thing. I think you get on some of the libertarian Facebook groups like I do on Facebook, and a lot of it is like a puritanical just base where someone's like, well, if someone could go on there and think, I think there should be somewhat regulations on firearms, and then you'll get even though they're in the UK, you have the diehard Second Amendment people that would just be like, we should have McNukes or, recreational 50 caliber guns. I'm fairly pro for someone born in Britain. I think I have a fairly pro gun outlook, but then I can also see at the same time an argument for there being no civil ownership of guns, because it is an awful lot of responsibility held within the population. So, it's really important to see it from both sides. Ultimately, if the right as a whole wants to, be a force for good in the UK, whether it is pushing for free markets, whether it's pushing for free speech, just traditional conservative or libertarian values, we should do it. Yeah, I really agree. It should be done as a united front rather than just being completely divided.
We all have our different opinions, but I think one thing that does turn the libertarians, well, at least, let's say, I don't want to say Libertarian Party because they're their own separate entity, but one thing that turns libertarians away from the Conservative Party is how controlling the Conservative Party can be sometimes, in the sense of you have to follow us, do as we say, do this, do that. There is no questioning within the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party is quite big. So it'd suck up any small group that comes into its void, which is unfortunate, of course, for politics. Again, I know some people might not see it like that, but I can understand why there is, of course, the big angst against the bigger parties. Because 100 years ago, there was no need for a Libertarian Party. We had the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
But not anymore.
I mean, it really is a difficult one. I think things like the think tanks and maybe what you're doing with the Conservative Alliance is quite powerful. I've become quite despondent with smaller parties. Obviously, we saw maybe 10 years ago, 5-10 years ago, the rise of UKIP as being this force that could potentially be the third party that would put a lot of pressure on the Conservatives. Things like the Libertarian Party, we've even seen it with Jeremy Corbyn and the Lib Dems, that the mainstream media is so powerful in the UK that small parties coming up, they will just absolutely destroy you. UKIP's been painted as this kind of racist, xenophobic, whatever ism you want to use on it. They can portray the Greens as being lunatics, even though that fundamentally they probably have some good values in there. Jeremy Corbyn, on the face of it, I think he was quite a dangerous person. I think a lot of his policies was misguided, but some of the media, the way they painted him, even me as a right winger thought, well, that's not really that fair what they're actually doing to him.
No.
Really remaining united is the only way to go forward.
But for me, I will just say, with the Conservative Party in its current form, I still would not touch it. Putting it nicely, the Conservative Party should be proud of its history, but it should not be proud of the direction it's taking currently. It's not conserving anything, and it keeps changing its direction to suit the vote. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, if a party loses its principles and just becomes the party of vote winning, now every party's out there to win votes. Let's not say that they're not. But when you are sacrificing your principles just to win a few votes, what is the point?
Yeah, there's a strong argument for that. There's like this idea in history that when you defeat your enemy, you ultimately become them. So, in the West we defeated communism, but then there's been a big encroachment of at least communist ideas into the West, universities, socialism in government. I think when Boris Johnson won in the previous, or the Conservatives won in the previous general election, we basically they defeated Labour, but ultimately they brought on so many policies that 10 years ago Labour would have loved to have. Government's getting a lot bigger, spending's going up. Ultimately, no one could have seen the virus coming, but off the back of this, if people were concerned about austerity for the last 10 years, it's probably going to really be significantly, nothing to what potentially is around the corner now. So, it's a really difficult position. The one thing I would say is there are some real traditional Tory backbenchers that really do have their roots in what the Conservative Party is traditionally about. And I think maybe people that, like I myself, I just voted for my local independent MP because I was a bit distrusting of this idea of modern one nation Toryism. Boris Johnson is a lovable character, but he is a bit flippy floppy. I talked about this on a lot of my YouTube channel. I never really trusted him over Brexit. We'll see what happens come June if they ask for an extension or not. I think the probability of that is probably quite significant at this point with everything going on in the world. But it's just highlight.
They have tied the hands with that though, because they've legislated against it. And Boris, if he goes back on his promises, it is going to give this revitalised Labour Party such ammunition.
The thing I really worry about is the time scale now. I don't think Boris Johnson was ever serious about a WTO Brexit. I think with the time scale we have left now, so we're 15th of April recording this, they have to either request the extension at the end of June, say 30th of June. That's not long. That's 2 and a bit months. And we only if they don't ask for the extension, everything needs to be done in terms of the deal by the end of November, because you want to allow at least 4 weeks for it to go through Parliament, be fully ratified. Just the timescales now, it seems the most likely outcome, if you're not going to ask for an extension, it would be a WTO Brexit. I'm not sure how serious Boris Johnson has ever. I think a WTO Brexit isn't the worst thing in the world by a long way.
It's not.
It's probably a lot more preferable to remain in when you look at everything that's happening in Europe at the moment.
Well, in the situation right now, WTO might actually work in our favour. Because like you've just said there, Europe's closing all its internal borders. They are not exporting to each other vital supplies, you could say. So what actual benefit is there being in the European Union, bar us paying out an excessive daily fee?
Yeah, I think the virus has really exposed the weakness that is the EU. And I think the way Italy and, say, Spain have been treated when the EU is giving away billions and billions to overseas nations, which on its own, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. That's a completely different debate. But
you look after your local neighbours first before tending to the world. Yeah,
exactly. And like Italy and Spain have been sort of devastatingly hit by this, and they've received almost nothing. So it's sort of exposed the political inability of the EU. Whether the inability is political or they just turn their backs on them, it's bizarre. It's really bizarre how it's played out. But
well, it just goes to show how it's structured. Germany, France, and you could say Britain, up until we voted to leave, were the 3 key players within the European Union. What we said went. Maybe not after we voted Brexit would you become less insignificant within the European Union. However, that don't bother me because I voted Brexit as a how old was I in 2016? God, I'm 23. I voted Brexit at 19 years old. I voted for Brexit. So I've been a diehard, at least Eurosceptic, since I were about 15, all thanks to Nigel Farage. So if it wasn't for UKIP, like you said, I would never have voted leave. Anyhow, what it's exposed is the tiered system. Germany and France right at the top. Then you've got your Mediterranean countries secondary, and your third right at the bottom is your Eastern European. And I think, and I'm kind of gutted that it won't be us British that ended up dismantling the European Union, but their own infighting over the virus.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of annoyed at that.
But at least we've led the way in terms of opening the gate. One thing I have been thinking about, talked about this a little bit on YouTube, is the possibility is, does Italy actually leave before the UK? Because we've been doing this drawn out 4-year transitional period, or we're in the transition now, but then 3 years of negotiating to get to the transition. Italy, I think, would leave if it chose to leave, which maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. There's a lot of ramifications for if it does, in terms of Italy's going to be in big problems. How does it sell its debt then denominated in lira? Who's really going to trust that? Who would really buy those bonds? There's a lot to talk about. But potentially, if Italy did leave, they would just go. They would probably leave within the space of a few days. It would just be like, right, just that Mediterranean kind of anger. Okay, we're just going, deal with it. We're not going to, you keep, the ECB owns hundreds of billions in, Italian debt. They were just like, well, you just keep that. That's your problem now. We're going back to the lira. It's a weird one. Like, potentially they could go before the UK, especially if we were to extend.
Of course, which I hope we don't extend.
Yeah, I'm really hoping
we can only see. I want to move on, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
How do you think the UK has reacted to this lockdown? Do you believe we have been united over the decision or not?
I think we have been overwhelmingly united. I think even the government, were coming out 2 weeks ago saying even they were surprised how much the UK has taken to the lockdown. We have these stories of the police maybe being a little bit overzealous in terms of the enforcement of it, but it seems to be largely few and far between. I mean, where I am in Milton Keynes, you can go out if you're going shopping and the streets literally are dead. Almost no one is out. And I've talked about this as well before, is you don't really need a police state lockdown, because if you just explain the facts to people, but look, this virus is going around, no one has immunity to it. We need to stop it. We need to try and protect the healthcare services as best as possible. People will naturally, I think the average British person is a good person. They will naturally do the right thing if you explain it. We don't need what I'm slightly against is the police state, which is encroached into it, because people naturally will do the right thing. We don't necessarily need the overzealous police reaction to it. I think that, if anything, will probably damage the police more long term than...
That's what I think we're gonna see from this, because, like you say, the isolated cases, but these isolated cases haven't been so isolated in the sense that Derbyshire police have been very overhand, but of course it's been localised to Derbyshire. And then if you look at other police forces, I don't know if you saw that video circulating, right, where a man didn't open his door. A neighbour dobbed him in, right, because he was being a bit loud, right, so they thought he had a party. He didn't open his door following guidelines from the government, and they kicked his door in. Yeah,
that's way too, and that probably is an abuse of police powers. When all this blows over, it'd be interesting to see, like, what was that illegal challenge just to break that door down, because generally it's playing music wouldn't generally trigger that. And the legislation has been a bit bulky and cumbersome, because it's a lot of it is just guidelines. So it's the individual officer on the street's interpretation of the law, which that essentially then is a police state. You're handing the judgment and the power over to the police officer. The police should be following clear and concise legislation, not maybe arrest them if you feel they need it. That's not the way we do policing, I don't think, in the UK or really in the West.
Another example I could give you is, again, like you've just said there, the misinterpretation. I've got a park not far from me, but it's not within walking distance, but it is like a reservoir park, okay? It's within walking distance, but for myself, but let's imagine you're a bit disabled, you're old. It's got lovely flat ground, so it's flat once you get there, but walking there, impossible. The police have they've locked up all the gates and they've stuck up signs, do you need to drive here? Driving isn't necessary to do exercise. It's like, yeah, but that's not in the government legislation. And the government have even come out saying you can drive necessarily to go do exercise. But police, like you're saying, because it wasn't written properly, the police are having to interpret it themselves, and this is what's leading to a problem. And I think we're going to get a big, massive distrust from the police. What they've done to rebuild relations after all the race issues they had pre-2000s, gone, destroyed. Because not only now do you could say the minority communities not trust them, the native English don't trust them either. They will not trust them if they carry on the way they are. And then what happens when a problem like this happens next time, or there's a second wave or a third wave of this?
I think that's a big problem, is because the way the government have communicated with it, they're not being clear how the unwinding process of the lockdown will be. Obviously, it's difficult for them to give a date because a lot of it is they're just like flying by the seat of their pants. How are the deaths? How are the new cases on a case by case or day by day, case by case basis? But because no one knows how the unwind or the unlock is going to work, like a lot of people I speak to, like on social media and just like friends who WhatsApp, are kind of expecting the lockdown's almost over, but we don't know. So if there is a second or a third wave and a second and third lockdown, I think that's really when the distrust in the police and the state will start coming, because people can cope with just a few weeks in their house, but ultimately if it's on and off for like a year, or if we're waiting for the vaccine, which by all accounts probably seems like it's well over a year away, I think a year is a long time to push and then still be happy with this police state model that we've gone down.
No, we British, we do not like being interfered with by the state, naturally. No. And we're biting, like you said, grin and bearing it for now, because, there are some numpties out there that are not taking social responsibility, but it's going to get to the point where we, who have been abiding by it, are going to go, you know what, screw this. I'm done. Yeah. I'm sick and tired of it now. I've had enough. And the police don't have the numbers to police us, and they say they'll bring the army in. I don't think the army would be able to manage it either. There aren't that many soldiers, if you think about it.
Yeah, there's not that many soldiers. And to be fair, they're not really trained in policing. So unless you want like a bloody Sunday incident, where the police, all the police can really do is all the army can really do is support the police in terms of like one officer, one soldier. I think it's ultimately, the police governed by consent, really, of the people. And you say we get to the point where, hopefully, it doesn't get to that point. Hopefully, in the next week or two, things start looking a bit more promising. I mean, I think the death rate the trend seems to be on a slight downtrend now. So hopefully, we're sort of getting.
Well, it was up until they introduced the care homes yesterday that weren't being included in the figures. Apparently, 2,000 deaths got added on yesterday.
Okay, yeah.
Just because they've not been, which is actually something that I want to move into within this topic. The key workers. I understand they're key workers, but how far do we go with this, almost turning them into saints, if you get what I mean? It's giving them a big ego drive, which I think in the long term is not going to be helpful societal cohesion either. You've already got it now where they're pitting each other against each other. So NHS are saying that care staff aren't necessary, and care staff are saying NHS staff aren't necessary. And then you've also got some of them, I'll say again, not every one of them, but isolated cases of them being judgmental of people that are having to work from home, going, well, I'm out here fighting the coronavirus, you're just sat at home. It's not going to be helpful, I don't think, for societal cohesion if we carry on this process of preferential treatment. Because I don't want to be nasty about it. And it is difficult what they're doing. I wouldn't want to do it myself. But for them to say that they never expected it, and to say that, they're in a battle zone, they're on the front line. Yes, they're doing hard work, but it's like a soldier complaining that he's on the front line. Something like this would have come up eventually. And it was a bit naive to assume that a pandemic would never come.
Yeah, I think that there was that government report, wasn't there, that got buried. I think, was it like 4 years ago that came out that we should expect a pandemic? So, I mean, because this virus is just an extension of SARS. It's I think the World Health Organization even called it essentially SARS-2. It's so similar. It's the same group of viruses. So yeah, we should have really expected it. And I think that's where questions. The problem is. The NHS is a quasi-religion in the UK. It's very difficult, and I say that my girlfriend works for the NHS, and she's probably more left-wing than me. I didn't go to university. She obviously, with her, she's a doctor, so she spent years and years at university. I think. So she's naturally going to be more left-wing than me, because the longer you do in state institutions like universities, you're probably going to be more left-wing, and also because of her job, it makes sense to be left-wing because. The Labour will essentially give NHS workers pay rises and things. So, there's self-interest to do with it. Sorry, we went off on a bit of a tangent there. What was the?
No, it's fine. I was just, I don't think I explained it 100% clearly. What I'm worried about is that once this lockdown is over, ultimately, are these key workers, quote unquote, and I say this because key workers covers a wide range. You've got the people keeping the telecoms alive.
Yeah.
You've got truck drivers making sure everyone's got their food. You've got the waterworks companies. You've got energy companies. But they're not getting no mention because, like you just said there, the quasi-state religion that is the NHS, it can do no harm.
Yeah.
And it's worrying if we get to that state where you can't even question the NHS because, you're questioning the religion that it is.
And as you say, like from a perspective, I think the more libertarian conservative person we have is it's really about individuals because there's good doctors, there's bad doctors, there's good health. There's people that I know that have fairly small businesses that are trying to get these loans from the government that haven't had these loans secured or through the banks or furloughing people, and they're paying their workers through their own savings, which ultimately this could cripple these people. I mean, they're trying to do the right thing, but if the bank loans don't come through or the government money doesn't come through, and the lockdown just lasts longer than people think, these people could potentially lose everything, and that's just as brave as an NHS worker who's having to do extra shifts, or these people are risking their entire livelihoods, their families, wealth. So we shouldn't. It's a bit silly just to say just the key workers are, because we know everybody is struggling. So, yeah.
And well, we the taxpayer, let's say you work in an office, all right, like I do. Okay.
Yeah.
We the taxpayer are just as important because we're the one providing the income available to allow the NHS to look after the vulnerable and infirm without us paying tax, because they're saying that 2 million people could be made redundant once this furloughing is over. Just because companies will not be able to survive the economic shock, right? Who's going to be paying the taxes then when the NHS are demanding their, I've been seeing pay rise demands, bonus demands, more money into the NHS. For the NHS, it's not money that's a problem. It's management. And this is a clear example. I saw today the Labour Party slagging off private care homes for not buying PPE. But I'm sorry, but Public Health England wasn't ready for this either, and Public Health England hadn't prepared to order in enough.
It is a really difficult one, and as you say, the PPE thing is silly, because I did talk about this on my YouTube channel. Some of the comments were like, well, how would the NHS fund this? But just having a bulk supply of PPE wouldn't cost them anything. It's like the people that prepared for the virus by stocking up their, not panic buying, but before it hit, I sort of had a few extra kilograms of rice and pasta in the cupboards. That's not cost me anything because I will use that supply up over time. So the NHS could have easily been prepared with a few million or a few 100 million surgical masks and extra gowns and things like that, because you would just eventually you'd whittle through that supply. It doesn't actually cost you. It's just prudent planning. And if the government were so insightful, then they would have surely recommended to these private care homes, well, we've got this reasonable theory that a pandemic will hit sooner or later. We'll pass this legislation or even just guidelines that you should probably adhere to. So it's very much finger pointing. I don't think there's many excuses that the NHS can really use for not being that prepared for this. Just in terms of the basic stuff. I mean, yes, they're always short of doctors and nurses and things like that, but they shouldn't be short of masks and they shouldn't be short of scrubs. That's just poor planning. I mean, what would you? It's a centrally planned bureaucratical organization. There's no surprise that there's a shortage. Any of the conservative, libertarian-minded people would say, well, generally bureaucratic organizations centrally planned are inefficient. They have shortages. They misallocate resources. That's not. I don't think any of us are surprised by that.
No. But that's a pretty good point to end it on, I think, with that topic, if you like.
Yeah, sure.
We're coming towards the last few questions, all right?
Yeah, sure.
On the podcast. We'll move on to China and the coronavirus. I think the public reaction to China following the outbreak of the coronavirus has been expected, and there's been calls to make China pay. But I do have to ask, how can we make China pay for this? How can we force them and punish them when most of our manufactured exports, most of their manufactured imports come to the Western world? Every technological device you have has 9 times out of 10 being built in China, even if the company's not Chinese, will also the amount of national debt. Where do you think we borrow all this money from? I was looking it up because I wrote an article about it the other day. $5 trillion China has loaned to the Western world. That includes Europe and America, and 1 trillion to the developing world. It's all right saying, all right, we'll punish you for this, we'll bill you for this. But how? When we owe them money too, and we're just as reliant on them, so they know this. So
I mean,
how can we force them to do anything?
I think that I know that China owns certainly percentage-wise a lot more American debt than UK debt. But if you really wanted them to pay, one way is you could force them to take a haircut on the bonds, or the the $5 trillion US dollars that China owns. You could say, well, if those bonds pay at say 1 or 2% interest, you could say,
Yeah,
well, if when that 30-year or 10-year bond expires, we'll give you back the principal sum, but we're not going to pay you any interest on it. I suppose that's one way you could claw back some of the money. I mean, I personally, I don't think going after China in terms of the money is really a sensible thing to do. I think maybe with globalization, I think maybe a lot of mistakes were made. I mean, I'm really free market, right? I think free market is the best way to lift people out of poverty. I don't want to see anybody.
exactly.
I don't want to see anybody in poverty in the UK, the West, in third world countries. And the more we trade with each other, it's the quickest way of raising living standards. I think most economic models show that. So I don't think we should have a financial attack on China by trying to fine them. But maybe mistakes are made. If you're doing free trade, great. But if the counterparty is a totalitarian, at least on
State.
paper, it's a communist state. Maybe there should be some, extra. If we trade so much with them that maybe America and the UK, we should have put a bit more leverage on them. Well, you're going to have to be a bit more open if we're going to do so much trade. Maybe we need, a bit more transparency with what's happening. Obviously, China seemed to keep some of it secret, but in terms of when the virus first hit. But I think that's probably the reason. Is that the reason why you think we should fine them all? Because if it's just
I'm not calling for them to be fined.
Yeah,
I take the position we cannot.
Yeah,
And not even in our moral position right now, because if I'm right, we owe them something shy of 200 billion ish, and it's been in the newspapers. It's been reported that we should fine them or bill them 315 billion. Yeah, but China would just come back and say, "Hold on, you owe us this." So before you getting into an argument over money, it's already been cancelled out because of what we owe them too.
Yeah,
but one thing I think we could teach China a lesson is doing what Japan's doing. And it's encouraging Japanese companies to bring its manufacturing back to Japan with a less reliance on China's economy to supply the world.
Yeah,
I think that would be a good way to teach them a lesson.
And I don't want to go down the road of let's just blame the government for everything, because
no.
One of the reasons why China has so much Western manufacturing is because for the last 20 years, we've been putting so much regulation on companies, like the environmental regulation, health and safety. So what happens when you shift the environmental stuff to China? You don't actually reduce CO2 because factories in the West tend to be cleaner than factories in China. But you just hide the problem. You sweep the problem under the carpet. You say, well, in the UK, we're lowering CO2 output. All you've done is you've just moved that, and now you need a super ship, a super tanker, a cargo ship to bring that product from China to the West. It's actually more inefficient, but the government regulations have created this. It's very difficult to set up a new manufacturing plant in the UK and America. So maybe that's something we need to consider. Are these environmental regulations, are they so burdensome that it's just almost impossible to do it in the West for at least a reasonable. So there are obviously factories in the UK.
Yeah, there are, but they're not making on the grand scale of things that China are. And one hitback I've had on that proposition is, but it'll be more expensive if it's made in the West. That might be true, okay? But I'd rather know that when I'm buying this product, it might be £50 or £60 more expensive, but I'm keeping one less person out of poverty in the UK.
Yeah,
That's one less person on the welfare system. That's one less person earning money and making a respectable living by us just buying and supplying goods to each other.
yeah, yeah. No,
So
there's a really strong argument for that. Yeah, I would agree. I think because if you can say the product is like £50 or £60 more expensive, but potentially your tax burden may be £50 or £60 less because, as you say, you've kept someone in a job, someone that doesn't need social housing or
yeah,
benefit. So the total cost to the UK may be less if there's more jobs, more manufacturing in the West. And not only that,
yeah,
if you're worried about the environment, it doesn't make any sense to make something in China then ship it 5,000 miles to the UK. If it was
no.
made in, say, Newcastle and it's shipped down to London, that's a lot greener than it coming from China.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think about claims, right? And I'll say this is not an opinion I hold at all. I'm on the fence of this, but what do you make of the claims that China did this on purpose? A biological weapon has been phrased around.
I don't believe many conspiracy theories, but I like to hear them. I think it's very important. People do have opinions, and on the face of it, I can't sort of see how China really benefits from this, because I think when this blows over, there's going to be a shift, as you say, in manufacturing away from China. I think is something that will happen. You say if the other Asian countries are calling for it, I think
Japan's giving out loans. Japanese government are
as far
giving
as
out
that, yeah,
loans to their big companies to bring it back, or even they're giving out loans to not even bring it back to Japan, but just to bring it out of China.
yeah. I just can't really see how China really benefits from that. I think people that do benefit from it, if you want to call, again, I don't necessarily believe in this conspiracy theory,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
there's arguments why the lockdown is as ferocious as it is, because this is really going to wipe out small and medium businesses. The big multinationals will weather this storm. McDonald's will weather this storm, right? But the small independent cafe on your local high street, the owner of that is probably rapidly running out of money and may never open again. So the multinationals are going to clean up after this, because when they do reopen, they've wiped out a lot of their competition in terms of the small businesses. I'm not saying that is the end goal just of the lockdown, but you have to look at who benefits from what situation. And as always, the big businesses tend to do well out of these recessionary environments because it clears the market of the competition. Is that?
yeah.
But going back to China, yeah, I just can't see. It's not something that I would necessarily believe they've done this on purpose. But I think it's important that there are people out there that are looking into these things, and if the information there was credible, then it's something I would certainly be happy to look at.
Exactly. Well, they do say a broken clock is right
Yeah,
twice a day.
yeah,
So, out to the needle of haystacks, one
yeah,
of them always does come up true. I think finally, a good one to wrap it up on is something a little bit more local. Keir Starmer, or Sir Kier Starmer as we should call him, has been elected as the Labour leader. What do you make of this? Do you think that with Keir Starmer at the helm, could they possibly win the next general election? Now, do bear in mind that we are yet to see what the Conservative government can do with Brexit, as it hasn't been delivered and coronavirus has taken up most of their first year agenda. There are also 4 more years to go yet before the next general election.
yeah,
But for me, I think Keir Starmer poses a threat to the Conservative government. And why I say that is the Conservative Party, through all of this, and even beforehand with its budget and its proposals in its manifesto, can no longer claim, I think, to be the financially prudent party. And that was the only thing keeping them in power. That and Jeremy
yeah,
Corbyn at the time. If it was someone else against Theresa May would have lost.
yeah,
So I think he could pose a threat if he plays his cards right, and if Johnson carries on with his, oh yes, here's 50 billion here, here's 100 million here, if he carries on down that road, I don't think anyone will see any reason to carry on voting Conservative, because it seems as if you vote Conservative, you get socialist policies.
yeah.
So you might
Yeah.
as well vote for the full package.
Yeah, cut the middleman out and go straight to. So with Keir Starmer, I think just by looking at him on presentation, he seems like PM material, right? He's very much like what I'd call like a classic British Prime Minister, not particularly likable, but also not particularly dislikable, bit of a grey man. So I think David Cameron was like this. I think there's a lot of hatred towards Tony Blair now because of the wars and things like that.
Definitely.
But he was very much a grey man. You didn't really like him, but also you didn't really like him. John Major, they kind of fit all these bills. I mean, if it's just the prime ministerial thing, it really is just a popularity contest, in my opinion. And Boris Johnson does do exceptionally well in that because he is a bit of an oddball. He's something different. Most people really like him. He's charismatic. He's charming.
Yeah.
So in the terms of the popularity contest, I think if things stay as they are, I would expect Boris Johnson to win a second term as prime minister if he still wants to put himself forward for that. I think one of the mistakes that Kier Starmer, or Sir Kier, should we call him, has made is with the cabinet or the shadow cabinet. There's just so much dead wood in there. I mean, you've got Ed Miliband. I didn't even know Ed Miliband's still kicking around these days. David Lammy, Emily Thornberry. You've got Rebecca Long Bailey, who is the Marxist, who is, just a basic continuation.
I think he's trying to keep at bay momentum whilst he can get full grip of the party.
That's what I was wondering. And you got Naz Shahar, who's the shadow minister. This is the one that retweets
from Rotherham.
Awful Rotherham tweet. And I think you're right. If it is just a clever play, and obviously he seems like a fairly intelligent man. I think his background's is a barrister or is a lawyer? I think he's got.
It was a lawyer. Yeah, he was. I want to say public rights defender or something like that.
Oh,
don't quote me on that.
Obviously an intelligent man, probably in terms of being a leader, probably a lot more capable than Jeremy Corbyn.
Definitely.
If it is a play that he's just got this temporary shadow cabinet, and then as we get nearer to the next general election, say in 4 years' time, he starts pulling out the maybe the Marxists, the people that are there just to keep momentum happy and the woke crowd happy. I think it is quite a big threat to Boris Johnson, and hopefully everything goes well with Brexit. I am worried. The thing is with the virus situation is obviously hindsight always has like 2020 vision. So when we look back, it's going to be very easy for people to say, well, Boris or the government should have done this then, or they failed to do that. It's almost like a bit of a poison chalice. You could ride through this and be a bit of a hero, which Boris Johnson is on at the moment.
Yeah.
But we're really in this big experimental phase at the moment. We've got countries like Holland, Sweden that are kind of, they're not really imposing a strong lockdown like
they're just imposing social measures, but those social measures are policed by the people, not the government.
Yeah,
that's the big difference there.
If it turns out that was the better model to use, then a lot of questions will be asked. But in 4 years' time, probably the worst of it will have blown over. But yeah, Boris Johnson does have problems on the horizon, and Keir Starmer. For people that want the Conservatives just to win every election going forward, Jeremy Corbyn was probably the best gift they ever could have had, because he wasn't particularly electable.
Theresa May remained in power, so that shows you all about her. Whilst I've got nothing wrong against her, I think she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unfortunately for her, she was stuck between a very small minority government, decided to call a general election. Then she brought out dementia tax, which, again, hindsight, is a very sound policy. But at the time, when trying to sell that to the electorate within 4 weeks, you're done. You didn't trust her on Brexit, and then she ends up back with a minority government. It just sucked for her. So Johnson does have the benefit of a majority of government, but I don't think that's going to remain in unity forever. There are still those people in there that have, you could say, drank the potion just to bottle Brexit and just get it done. But do they actually believe in it? No. Do a lot of the Conservative voters, yes, who was lent to them from the Labour Party, especially in the northern heartlands where I'm from, but does the Conservative Party in principle believe in Brexit? No, I don't think it does. So I think it's going to come up with a lot more trouble. Again, with the NHS demanding more money, more support, this is going to turn into a big battle between Labour and the Conservative Party, because I don't think the Conservative Party will give in to it wholly, and the Labour Party will always hold its feet to the fire on that. Of course, it's right not to give in to it wholly, because the country can't afford it.
Yeah.
But I do believe we're going to have some big social issues on the horizon. People are already saying this is a failure of capitalism, what's happening right now, even though I don't know how an economic model can stop a virus.
Yeah.
But so I think he's got a lot on his plate. And is he going to carry on being the showman about this? And if he does, I don't think people will take him seriously going forward. So that's where the threat comes from.
Yes,
I think anyway.
He's got a lot of problems ahead of him.
He does.
I mean, but Boris Johnson is like a 1 in a million. When you look at the other people that were in the Conservative leadership race, there was no one really, I don't think, who, if we didn't have Boris Johnson now, I think, you know, we would probably think, well, this will just be a one term, or this will be the last term for the Tories, and then we'll go back to probably a Labour government. But he is, I think he is someone special. And say I didn't vote for the Tories, but I do think he's someone, and I think he does have the potential to sort of, he's almost like Teflon Tony, like he's like bulletproof Boris, as I sometimes call him. Like they do seem, up until now, the bullets have like deflected off him. But as you say, I think the big one will be what happens when we need to start paying back this money that the hundreds of billions the government are using up. Borrowed. Is it austerity? Do we just say, well, we're just going to print the money, and further down the road maybe expect high inflation? It's a real juggling act.
Well, they're looking, aren't they? They're looking at removing the triple lock on the state pension, and increasing taxes, and removing tax allowances, which is not going to go down well, especially when, again, the public sector moans about no pay rise. You've had pay rises in comparison to the private sector that's been stagnant for so long. We're only just above inflation, just. Yeah. And after all of this, I'm not too sure.
I think the one thing that would do really well for Boris is if we do leave on the end of this year, 31st December, and Europe just descends into an absolute mess, I think at least probably the people will just look and say, well, at least we're not bad as them. So we must be doing something right. The fact that we don't have the problems that France and Italy and the rest of them have. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting 4 years, I think, for politics.
It is. Yeah, it is. Well, I think I'd like to end the podcast there, if that's all right with you. I have enjoyed it, I'm not going to lie. I'd like to thank you, Jason, for coming on.
No, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for having me on.
It's all right. If you'd like to see any of Jason's videos, then please search for LibertyBunker on YouTube. I'd also like to say thanks to everyone who's been listening to the Conservative Lights podcast. Before we go, I'd appreciate that if our listeners have enjoyed our podcast, to hit like, press subscribe, and until next time, goodbye.